Over the course of a few days, I've come to remember a number of pretty weird happenings around my old childhood home. I've been able to confirm some with my parents, but my siblings either claim to not remember, or they believe that the events may have been pranks set up by my younger siblings. Sometimes, they'd say that nothing strange ever happened in that house. It would probably be wise to explain a little bit about this house. This all happened in the early 90s. My parents had moved to a new city, all while my mother was pregnant with my younger brother. When shown the home, my parents took note that nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but also that the showing was rather brief. In need of a quick living arrangement, they decided to rent the house, move in, and to their dismay, found the basement filled to the brim with markings all over the walls and floorboards. The walls had spray-painted Nazi symbolism, coupled with what my father describes as odd circles, but my mother confirms as witches' circles, or demonic markings, some burned into the wood. My mother later confirmed a few Ouija boards were etched to the walls as well. They complained, and instead of moving, they had the entire basement cleaned, repainted, and continued to stay for the duration of my childhood. The first occurrences happened when I was between the ages 5 and 9 years old, continuing for the entire 4 years. Roughly, every night, I would refuse to go upstairs under any circumstance. I would physically refuse and fight my mother or father, often throwing a huge fit when they attempted to physically move me upstairs. When finally asked why I was so vehemently refusing to go upstairs, I outright told my parents, "The girl in the white dress at the top of the stairs says it's not safe yet." The funny thing is, I remember the little girl, up until recently. I can't remember her face, but I remember she was about 7 and would tell me not to come upstairs because it wasn't safe. She wouldn't outright speak, but she'd convey the message while shaking her head. I remember that because it scared me the most when I was a kid. She would look in the direction of my room for a little bit, every so often. Then she'd simply look at me and disappear. That was when I knew it was safe to go upstairs. When I reached the age of 10, this stopped happening altogether. I never saw the girl again, but different, stranger things began to happen. You see, someone was murdered in our backyard, moments before my father came home one night. Fortunately that night, he decided to come through the front door, instead of entering the house through the back. Later the next day, odd meat was thrown into our backyard, and I found out about it when we noticed our dog smelling it. My dad brought him in, and the police restricted all access to our backyard for the remainder of the year. We later found out that the victim was shredded to death. We always assumed that was the meat. Of course, this likely made things worse, as a lot of the blood from that meat was on our property and took a while to clear out. Within the same year, my brother and I had a small area set up for us in the basement to play. Every time we'd go down there, we would hear a faint, yet strange whistling sound. This whistling was very similar to a human whistling a tune while doing busy work, but was eerie and very unsettling. For the entire year, my brother and I were trying to find the source of this whistle, and when we found it, we were terrified. I remember that day very well. I was turning 11 soon, and we followed the sound to behind the furnace. There, we found a shadow, similar to a human shadow, cast upon the wall. It was tall, it had a hat, no features, just like a normal shadow. It confused us. because we didn't understand how a shadow was there, because there was no light behind the furnace. It was dark, but the shadow was somehow darker. Then it looked at us. I used quotes because, physically, it couldn't look at us, but we just knew. We knew it was looking at us. Then it whistled. I'll never forget that tune. I'm not sure if anyone knows the tune, but it was the tune used for yodeling. Needless to say, we ran upstairs to our mom, terrified. She came to check it out, despite us telling her not to, and found nothing. We didn't play in the basement for a week after that, but every so often, we would hear the whistling during the week. And despite us asking our parents if they heard it, they never did. We eventually went back into the basement to play, at the insistence of our parents, and everything was okay for a little bit. But eventually, the shadow came back. It would always get our attention with the same tune, always trying to convince us to come and touch it, to see it. Neither of us would ever approach it, and we soon after realized it was stuck to the walls, literally. It couldn't go up the stairs, and could only travel along the walls, except for the stairway wall. As long as we remained away from the walls, the Shadow Man couldn't get to us, and it eventually resorted to yelling, before eventually leaving forever. After I turned 12, it never appeared again. However, strange things continued to occur in the basement. It was the summer of my 12th year. My brother and I had my cousins over, and were playing as my parents and other family members were cleaning up after a barbecue. As we played, the furnace began to glow a bright red on the filter door, as if it was being heated by a torch. It had started from the center of the door, and grew to encompass the entire door, before receding and leaving a bluish-green stain behind. Needless to say, we were all confused. My cousin, who often spent time with his contractor dad, insisted that we take the filter door off and check if it caught fire. We tried to tell him about the weird stuff in the basement, but he didn't believe it, and was convinced the filter burned. Upon taking the door off and inspecting the door, it was pristine on the inside, in its entirety. The door was still the standard silver, without any indication of burning, and the filter was its standard whitish gray, clean and new as it was replaced not too long ago. He took the filter off, and there was just a vent. Below that, a sizable amount of space, and a space to reach the pilot light hatch for the furnace. He put everything back, confused. We got our parents, and his dad checked everything out. Other than the door exterior, the furnace was in perfect shape. After this incident, nobody would go in the basement again for a while, unless to put something in storage. That was, until I turned 16, and insisted upon no longer sharing a room with my brother. I'd forgotten the past, setting aside my childish fears, and decided to move into the basement. Things start to get a lot more terrifying when you sleep in an unfurnished basement at night. I had consistent nightmares and weird sightings to the point where I often slept at my friends' houses to simply avoid sleeping in that basement. But I will share the most terrifying experience that I ever had, as my friends ceased to ever stay at my house and insisted upon staying at theirs. Due to often staying at my friends' houses, their parents began to get a little frustrated that I would never invite them over to my own home to stay the night. I often insisted against it, but eventually relented, as the perfect opportunity came up when my friend's parents went away for a week, and he was left to stay at my place for the duration. Needless to say, he was delighted, but I was extremely worried. To explain the basement a little, in order to gain some privacy, and as my family was not well off, we set up a wall using a bedsheet stapled to the beams of the basement ceiling. These sheets were effectively the walls of my room, with a small opening as an entrance. Everything was fine for most of the week, until roughly the fourth day. Around midnight, my friend couldn't get any sleep and decided to try and get some shut-eye on the armchair in the corner of my room, which faced the bedsheet wall. As I was asleep, he awoke in a cold sweat and noticed the bedsheet ruffling a little bit. He noticed what seemed like a handprint on the other side of the sheet, pressing against it. Assuming it was my sister, who had a crush on him at the time, he jokingly asked the person on the other side to come around. On the fifth day, he got over it, assuming it was just a dream, and eventually, the night came upon us once more. Much like the night before, he woke up in a cold sweat that night. But this time, he awoke to find a girl in a white dress, about our age, standing at my bedside and just looking at me. He told me she wasn't scary, and her face wasn't messed up, but she looked sad. When she saw him, she simply looked at him, frowned, and walked towards the exit again, and he didn't dare move. The next morning, he told me that I was having nightmares as she stood over me. He didn't stay the rest of the week, and we moved a few months after that happened. My friend always insisted that I stay at his place until we moved. When he'd come over to visit, he would never go into the basement, not even to help me move my stuff. I dream about the house every so often. Weird, lucid dreams. I can never really go into the basement in these dreams, and sometimes I can't enter the house, but it always seems different, ethereal. I will never know what happened down in that basement before we lived there, but there is something truly evil down there. I'm just glad we moved out before someone got hurt.
Please leave your message